Hey everybody, welcome back to the Mana League's Magic Origins set review. Today we're going to jump into blue, but first off, the three disclaimers as always. First off, this is a limited set review. All of my discussions of these cards, all of my ratings of these cards will be based on draft and sealed. Not on standard, modern, legacy, commander, cube, nothing. Just limited. So be aware of that. Number two, I have not played with these cards. I have not had them in my hands. I have not proxied them. I've never used them. So my ratings are based on sort of my first glance at the card, my ability at evaluating cards, and at sort of viewing how the format may shape up. Finally, these are just my opinions. I may be wrong. Or simply, we may just view cards differently. And I definitely want to hear if you disagree with a rating, if you think a card is much more powerful or much weaker, definitely let me know. It's not good to just have somebody say this card is a B and for everybody to just accept that. It's very good to have discussions about that. So definitely let me know in the comments below. But without further ado, we're going to jump right on into blue. First up, we've got a big one. We've got Aeronaut, High Arbiter. It is a 5/blue legendary creature Sphinx at rare. And it's a 5/5. And it's got flying. So it's a 5/5 flyer for 7. Does more than that, of course. It says, as Al-Hamarat High Arbiter enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose the name of a non-land card revealed this way. Your opponent can't cast spells with the chosen name. Obviously, this is much more of a constructed card. It's really good when you can name Hero's Downfall, and your opponent can't cast any of the 4 Hero's Downfalls sitting in their deck. In Limited, 99% of the time, you're going to be hitting one card. Now that could still be good. You know, the opponent could have a big bomb in their hand, and now as long as Al-Hamarat's down, they can't cast it. And that's not too shabby. It may, however, just be prohibitively expensive to cast this guy. 7 mana for a 5/5 is asking a little bit much. That's asking a little bit much. We can get a 4/4 for 5 usually. So 1 extra power, 1 extra toughness, and we're paying 2 more for the ability of turning off a card in their hand, which sometimes will be awesome. But sometimes we hit, I don't know, some little tiny garbage card that we don't really care about. So ultimately, I feel like this guy's too expensive. I'm going to go with a B- because he is big and splashy and bomby, and if you stick him down, he's going to do a lot of work. But you have to get there. And whether getting there is worth the investment, I'm just not sure. So, I mean, it sounds like I'm down on the card and I'm giving it a B-. Just sort of understand what that kind of means and what I'm going on about that. If it turns out that the format's just fast and you can't get this guy out, this is going to drop even further, but I'm going to start him at a B-. Next up, we have Anchor to the Ether. This is a 2 and a blue sorcery at uncommon, and it says put target creature on top of its owner's library. Scry 1. So this is another in a long history of bounce spells that work basically like this, where you cast it and it goes on top of their owner's library. A similar one that we all know recently was Whisk Away, which was a target attacking or blocking creature. This is any creature. It doesn't have to be done during the combat step, and in fact it can't be done during the combat step because it's sorcery speed, which is a knock against it. Sorcery speed really hurts this effect. You're not turning your opponent off of an entire turn with that creature, plus turning off a draw step. At best, that creature's going to be down next turn. Hands down, because you're going to cast this during main phase 1 or main phase 2 on your turn, and in a few short phases, the creature is back on the battlefield. That hurts it. The Scry 1, that helps it. Scry 1 is pretty powerful. That's why we may be getting Scry 1 as part of our mulligan decisions coming up, or post-mulligan decisions, I should say. So ultimately, I think this falls in a C+. It's not as awesome as, say, Voyage's End, which was instant speed, but I think it's still playable. I think it's cuttable in some situations for sure, but I think it's probably a little bit more playable than it is cuttable. So C+. I could see it just not being good at sorcery speed, but I'll have to play with it to really find out. Next up is Artificers Epiphany. This is a 2 and a blue instant at common, and it says draw 2 cards. If you control no artifacts, discard a card. So this is, as far as the first sentence goes, divination at instant speed. which is awesome. Divination is fine at sorcery speed. At instant, it would be absolutely awesome. Now, we have to discard one if we don't have any artifacts. If I had no artifacts, this is still instant speed kind of loot kind of thing, which is still fine by me. And if I do have an artifacts, and blue is one of the 2 artifact colors in this set, this card becomes really good. Ultimately, I don't think it's a high pick, but I think it's a fine card in a lot of decks, even if it's not the artifact deck. And in the artifact deck, I think it's just really good. I'm going to go with a C on it, because it is kind of, you know, you really want to be in one deck for this, and it does fall off a bit, but I think it's still fairly okay. Next up, we have Aspiring Aeronaut. This is a 3 blue creature human artificer at common for a 1/2. And it has flying. Flying 1/2 for 4. Well, it's got to have something else. It says, when Aspiring Aeronaut enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Now, this is the artifact sub-theme of blue and red. It's Thopters. Thopter is going to be an archetype. There's a ton of cards that put out Thopters. So what this really kind of is a 2/3 flyer for 4, which is, you know, fairly par for the course, I would say, in most sets. And spread across 2 bodies is actually fairly decent. The 1/1 flyer isn't that exciting, but the fact that there is so much that goes on with these 1/1 Thopters makes this a little bit better. In the artifact deck, I think this guy is higher. Outside of the artifact deck, I think he potentially might just be a little bit clunky. I think there may just be better things out there. So I'm going to go with a C- just because I do feel like I want him for one deck more than I do for anything else. I'll really have to see how he plays out, how effective those Thopters can be if you're not getting any sort of additional synergy out of them by being in the artifact deck. Next up, we have Boned Ash. This is a 2 blue instant at common, and it says counter target creature spell. Draw a card. So Boned Ash is a totally fine counter spell. The majority of spells, I've talked about this over and over, the majority of spells that you will see in Limited are creatures. So a spell that counters creatures is generally pretty good. Essence Scatter was pretty good in the core set that it was in 1 or 2 core sets ago. This one's more expensive than Essence Scatter. It's 2 more expensive than Essence Scatter, but you get a card out of it, which is pretty darn good. It does replace itself. I'm fairly happy with Boned Ash. I think it goes in controlling decks. I think you do want 1. I don't know if you would want more than 1 necessarily, but I think it does go as a 1-of in control decks, and you can pick them up because nobody else is going to want them. So I go with just a solid C on this one. Next up, we have Calculated Dismissal. This is a 2 and a blue instant at common, and it says counter target spell unless its opponent pays, unless its controller pays 3. So it's mana leak for 1 more. But there's more. It says spell mastery. If there are 2 or more instants and or sorceries in your graveyard, scry 2. So this is mana leak for 3, which I think is possibly still okay. The massive benefit, of course, of mana leak is you can mana leak their turn 2 play, and there's 0 chance of them having something. There's 0 chance of them being able to pay for it. Mana leak for 3, well, they start to get a chance to pay for it pretty rapidly after turn 3. Turn 4, arguably, they could play a 1-drop, and you can't Calculated Dismissal that. Remember, it falls off in the late game fast. Any of these, unless controller pays 1 or 2 or 3, falls off really, really fast as the game goes on and your opponent gets more and more mana. Now, unfortunately, Spell Mastery is not going to be on in the early game ever, really. Spell Mastery is something that's going to happen on turn, I would guess, 6 or later. And on turn 6 or later, the spell gets really bad. So I think ultimately I'm going to have to go with a C- on this. Which hurts, because this is a mana leak. It's our namesake. But it's a worse mana leak, let's be honest. So yeah, I'm going to go with a C- on it. Next up is Clash of Wills. This is an X-blue instant at uncommon. And it says, counter. We've got 3 counter spells in a row. Counter target spell, unless its controller pays X. X counter spells are awesome. A counterspell that says your opponent has to pay 3. That gets really bad on turn 8. A counterspell where you get to decide how much your opponent has to pay is awesome, because on turn 8 you can make them pay 7, which they probably can't pay for most things. What's even better is that if they tap out 8 mana, you can say, well, you have to pay 1. So you can counter their 8 mana spell for 2 mana, which is fantastic. That's really good. This is a counterspell I really, really like and I think is pretty valuable. Now, counterspells don't go in every deck. Obviously, they go in very grindy decks, and they go in maybe a little bit more tempo-y decks as well. Aggro doesn't want those. So make sure you know what deck you're putting this in, but if you have the deck that wants it, I think it is pretty decent. I'm going to go with a C+. In the right deck, it could even be higher than that, to be honest. I would say B- if you're in a controlling deck, but overall, let's say C+. Next up is Claustrophobia. This is a 1 blue enchantment aura at common, and it's a good aura. It's a good aura because it's a removal aura. Enchant creature. When Claustrophobia enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature. Enchanted creature doesn't on-tap during its controller's on-tap step. This is a reprint. It was in Innistrad, I think, originally, or maybe Dark Ascension, but I think Innistrad. Don't quote me on that. It was also reprinted in a core set, I think M15, maybe M14. It's a really solid removal spell. It's the typical blue removal that doesn't just kill the creature, it just puts them out of commission generally for the entire game, unless your opponent either has enchantment removal, or in this case, untaps the creature, because it only taps the creature the turn it comes in. If they find a way to untap the creature, it's going to stay untapped until they tap it again. So keep that in mind. I've seen that question come up sometimes at FNMs and whatnot. So keep that in mind, but it is still just solid blue removal, and I give it a solid B. I'll take these pretty highly. Yeah, I love Claustrophobia. Next up, we have Days Undoing. This is a 2 and a blue sorcery at Mythic, and it's gotten some press, but not for limited. Each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, then draws 7 cards. Now, for a really weird statement, if it's your turn, end the turn. Now, I don't think there's any way of casting this on your opponent's turn. It is sorcery speed. In limited. In constructed, you could do quicken and then this and whatnot. But in this format, I don't think you're ever casting this on your opponent's turn. Which means you're casting it on your turn and ending your turn. And yes, you have 7 cards, but your opponent has 7 cards and gets to untap with them. And that's a real negative. Now, this card is pre-ordering for a lot of money. You're going to take this card first pick at FNM, hands down. Why would you not pay for the draft and potentially a second one, depending on what your drafts cost at FNM or whatever? In a competitive environment, if you're actually playing for, more than $20, I don't think you want to take this. I think this is just bad in draft and sealed. I would say F, to be honest. I just don't think it's a playable card. I think you give your opponent way too much of a benefit by playing this card. Don't take this competitively. Of course, take it casually, where you keep what you draft and you pay for your draft. Next up, we have Deep Sea Terror. This is a 4 blue creature serpent at common for a 6/6. So it's a 6/6 for 6. It's pretty good. But it also says Deep Sea Terror can't attack unless there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Womp, womp. So it's a 6/6 on turn 6. But if you don't have Threshold, which is what 7 cards in your graveyard used to be called, it was a specific mechanic, this guy's not going anywhere. He's just going to sit there. Now, to be honest, I've had some success with these type of sea serpents as blockers in the past. I've never ever really wanted to play them, but when I've had to put them in my deck, they have done work as blockers. Even with that experience, I don't recommend you do that. It's just too inactive of a thing to do. It's not going to win you the game sitting there blocking. Sure, maybe someday you'll get 7 cards in your graveyard and then you can start attacking with it, but that could take a long time, at which point your opponent could just fly in the air for 2 for 6-7 turns and you're just dead. Yeah, so I don't recommend taking this. I don't recommend playing it. I give it a solid D. I don't give it an F because I do know my experience with these when I've been desperate, and it's been okay, but that's very results-oriented thinking, because I'm sure had I had included it more often, I would see it just be a horrible card. Next up, we have Disciple of the Rings. This is a 3 blue creature, human wizard at Mythic for a 3/4, and it says a lot. 1, pay 1. Exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. Then, after you pay that and do that, choose 1. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Or, Disciple of the Rings gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Or, tap target creature. Or, on-tap target creature, and that's the last one. So you can counter a spell if its controller can't pay 2. You can give Disciple of the Rings +1/+1 until end of turn. You can tap a creature. You can on-tap a creature. Now, this has the usual non-creature spells aren't super common in limited speech, blah, blah, blah. You know that already. So the first ability doesn't seem all that special, especially because it's going to fall off really, really heavily in the late game. Now, in addition, that also means that you may just not have too many resources to actually activate this guy. You need instants and sorceries in your graveyard. And of course, by exiling them, you're turning off spell mastery, so you want to make sure that you don't have that anti-synergy happening in your deck. But let's keep going. +1/+1 till end of turn? No. I don't really want to do that. I mean, cool. Like, if that instant sorcery isn't doing anything else in my graveyard, I guess I could just pump him 1 or 2 if I have 2 instant sorceries. But it's just not exciting. Tap a card, or tap a creature, probably seems like the best mode on this, and I think it's the default limited mode. You can tap a creature down, attack in, get in some damage, etc. I think that's the default mode. On tap a creature seems okay. I just don't see this guy getting your opponent that often, because your opponent's going to know what instants and sorceries you have in your graveyard. They're going to know if you can activate this guy. He's on the battlefield. Unless your opponent is just out of the game and not paying attention, they're going to make proper attacks. So ultimately, I just don't think this guy's super awesome in limited. I think he's still fine. I think that tapping mode really does keep him in limited. I think that keeps him as a decent card in limited, the tapping mode. I don't think the other modes do. I'm going to give him a B-. He does seem pretty fun, I'll admit. And I think he might be going for a bit of money at the moment, so he's a value pick anyways. But I don't think he's quite a powerhouse or quite a bomb. There's just a few things just holding him back slightly. So I'm going to go with a B- on him. I'd have to play with him. Maybe he's just awesome. I'm not sure. The tapping, as I said, seems like the best for limited. Next up, we have Disperse. This is a 1 and a blue instant at common, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. On summon is awesome. This is a tiny bit more expensive on summon that can also hit artifacts, auras, planeswalkers, etc. Yeah, this card's just good. Bounce is good. Tempo is good. You can just, time walk your opponent. Just say, oh, you spent 5 mana on that creature. Well, it's back in your hand now. Do it again. And on that turn, you just get to swing and for some damage or whatnot. I'll take these relatively highly and be pretty happy with it. I give it a solid B. Next up, we have Displacement Wave. This is an X blue spell, sorcery, at rare. And it says return all non-land permanents with CMC X or less to their owner's hands. So you pay X and everything, yours and your opponent's, that is X or less CMC, converted mana cost, goes back to their hands. This is going to be really hard to use consistently. The ideal here is that you have like a 6-drop and your opponent has nothing but 1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s. And so you Displacement Wave for 5, and then you get to attack with your bomb. But it's not that common that that's going to be a thing. And if you have a 6-drop down and your opponent only has a bunch of 2s, you're probably in pretty good shape anyways. So I think this is going to be pretty hard to use consistently to get any real benefit out of it. And this isn't a wrath effect. Those creatures don't die. They're all, or as many as possible, are going to just hit the battlefield again next turn. So ultimately, I just think it's a bit too weak to be premium. So I'm going to go C+ on it. It's got power behind it, but I don't think it's going to be that awesome. Next up, we have Dreadwaters. This is a 3 and a blue sorcery at common, and it says target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of lands you control. Don't touch this card. It's bad. Mill is bad. Mill is only okay in limited if it's very easily repeatable. And a single sorcery is not very easily repeatable. Don't play this card. Don't ever play this card. F-. Next up, we have Fairy Miscreant. This is an uncommon creature fairy rogue. There we go. I knew it had two subtypes. At common, and it's a 1/1. And it flies. It's a fairy, of course, so it's a 1/1 flyer for 1. Not the best. But it has more. When Fairy Miscreant enters the battlefield, if you control another creature named Fairy Miscreant, draw a card. So this is just like Cleric of the Forward Order? Cleric of the Forward Order, yes. There's a cycle of these cards that care about whether you have multiples. Very importantly, this effect does not stack. It says, if you control another one, draw a card. So it doesn't care if you have 5. If you have 5, yes, you control another one. Draw a card. You don't draw 5 cards. So keep that in mind. The effect doesn't stack, which means having multiples of these doesn't do much for you. Maybe it ensures that you'll get that single card draw, but it's not worth putting a 1/1 for 1 flyer in your deck. Don't touch these. Solid F from me. 2 Fs in a row, wow. Next up, we have Harbinger of the Tides. This ain't going to be an F. This is a blue-blue creature merfolk wizard at rare, and it's a 2/2. 2/2 for 2. Cool. However, you may cast Harbinger of the Tides as though it had flash if you pay 2 more to cast it. 2 colorless. When Harbinger of the Tides enters the battlefield, you may return target tapped creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. This guy's pretty fun. He's not a powerhouse, he's not a bomb, he's just a really useful utility creature. Basically, you can pretend that this guy is a 2/2 for 4 with flash that bounces probably an attacking creature. Probably why you would flash it in. Pretty solid. There'll probably be some less likely scenarios than bouncing attacking creatures. Maybe you bounce a creature to get in for attacks. But I think attacking creature is probably going to be the place where you often use this. Yeah, this guy just seems awesome. He seems so solid. As I said, he's one of these cards that isn't a bomb, but it will do so much to help your game. It's such a good utility creature. Plus, I just love bouncing creatures. I'm going to give it a B- just because it's not bomb territory, but it is just pretty damn good. B-, maybe even a B. Next up, we have Hydra Lash. This is a 2 and a blue instant at uncommon, and it says attacking creatures get -2/-0 until end of turn. Draw a card. Awful. Just don't touch this. It's fog, but it's not even a fog, because it doesn't prevent combat damage if your opponent's creatures are more powerful than 2. Horrible. You know, sure, maybe you can set up some instances where you can block and your guys can live, but I don't like it. I don't like this card. I don't like it at all. You get to draw a card off of it, so that's kind of cool. Maybe I'm underestimating it. Maybe I'm underestimating this because it is a one-sided fog, but it just seems like there's going to be so many times where this is a dead card, and that's just not what I want to have happen. So I've got to give it an F. We'll see. I feel like this could be a card that I'm wrong on. I don't think I'll be wrong by far. I think maybe it'll go up to like a D or a C-, but I'm going to go with F. All right, next up we have Jace, both his baby side and his grown-up side. We have Jace Vryn's Prodigy. This is a 1 and a blue legendary creature, human wizard at Mythic for an 0/2. Jace has no power. Jace says tap, draw a card, then discard a card, so loot. If there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, exile Jace Vryn's Prodigy, then return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control. Baby Jace is awesome. It's Merfolk Looter. It's very literally just Merfolk Looter, and Merfolk Looter is awesome. Not a bomb. It's not going to win you the game alone, but the card advantage is going to add up and up and up. Honestly, I'm really going to hate flipping Jace. I would love if Jace just stayed Merfolk Looter Jace for forever. But he does grow up when you get 5 or more cards in the graveyard and loot. He becomes Jace Telepath Unbound, a Planeswalker Jace at Mythic. Starts with 5 loyalty, that's pretty high. The +1 ability says up to 1 target creature gets -2/-0 until your next turn. That's garbage. That is just awful. It's like Hydra Lash. It doesn't even stop big creatures at all. It makes them a little bit smaller, but I don't like the +1. I think the +1 is garbage. You use the +1 because you can't use the -3. That's the only reason that I would ever see using it. The -3 says you may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that card would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So basically you give a spell flashback. Now that's pretty cool. I wouldn't try to be too cute with this by like looting away a spell with the intent of flashing it back, because Jace may just die before then. Don't throw away a spell expecting to get it back with Jace. Keep the spell in your hand. You know, get it to the graveyard by casting it the first time around. But this is going to be the primary use for Jace in Limited, I think, and arguably even in Constructed if he sees any play whatsoever. Yeah, -3 I think is good. -9, things aren't going to look good for Jace. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, target opponent puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So you cast a spell, they mill 5. Big freaking whoop. It's just terrible. I don't see any reason I would ever want to -9 Jace. I don't ever see the reason I'd really want Jace to get up to 9. I just want to give some spells flashback, have Jace soak up some damage, and then die. Unfortunately, adult Jace just is bad. I don't think he has a place in Limited. I think he's just awful. Fortunately for Jace, baby Jace is awesome, and he's still going to get a B from me. You're going to first pick this for value, obviously, or whatever. But as far as competitive good Limited goes, I think he's a B, because he's a Merfolk Looter. Unfortunately, he's a Merfolk Looter that goes away even without dying, because he'll flip after the 5th time you loot, and even faster if anything's died or you've cast anything. So, B for me. Yeah, grown-up Jace did not grow up well. Next up, we have Jace's Sanctum. This is a 3 and a blue enchantment at rare, and it says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, scry 1. I think this is just a solid F. It costs a card slot in your deck. It doesn't come down until turn 4 at a minimum. It doesn't impact the board. Most Limited decks don't have that many spells. Ultimately, it's just not a card I ever want to bother with. Solid F for me. Next up, we have Jessian or Yessian, probably, actually, I don't know. Jessian Thief. 2 and a blue creature, human rogue at uncommon for a 1/3, and it has prowess. Prowess, of course, if you don't remember from the block we were just in, is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. It also says whenever Jessian Thief deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So, I mean, I get to talk about prowess forever now, because it's an evergreen keyword. Remember, you can't expect to be just prowessing left, right, and center, because you're going to be playing 6, maybe 7 non-creature spells. And of course, if you try to build a prowess deck and have a whole bunch of non-creature spells, then you don't have the prowess creatures to trigger. Yeah, I'll have to talk about that forever now. Never bet on prowess in Limited. So we're really looking at a 1/3 that sometimes will be a little bit bigger. A 1/3 is the easiest creature ever to block, because everything can block it and just kind of bounce off of it. Even if it doesn't kill it, it's probably not going to trade with anything. If you can draw cards off this successfully, then cool, good job, because that'll be some value. But I don't see that opportunity coming up all that often. It feels like kind of low-grade filler to me, easily cuttable, so C-. Next up, we have Maritime Guard. This is a 1 and a blue creature, Merfolk Soldier at common, and it's a 1/3 with no text. It's got flavor text, but no rules text. A vanilla 1/3 for 2. I don't see a deck where I ever want to play this. I cannot ever remember playing a 1/3 with no ability, or basically no ability, as we have seen some, and being happy with it. They serve next to no purpose. The purpose is to trick new players into saying, hey, this will stop my opponent from attacking for 3 or 4 turns. But stopping your opponent from attacking doesn't win you the game. It doesn't do anything for you. It buys you time, but you want to be active in a game of Magic. You want to be proactive. You don't want to be reactive. And this is reactive. This is garbage. Total F. Next up, we have Mizzium Mendler. This is a 2 and a blue creature Vidalcan wizard at rare, and it's a 1/4. It has flash, so you can flash in your 1/4, but it has something cooler. It says, when Mizzium Mendler enters the battlefield, you may change a target of target spell or ability to Mizzium Mendler. It has Spellskite's ability. This seems pretty decent. Again, it's an awesome utility creature that isn't at all a bomb. It's not going to win you the game. It's going to do something really, really cool once, though. It can essentially counter removal. They remove this 1/4 instead of your 5/5 flyer or whatever. Even more effectively, it can stop burn damage. If they lightning bolt or whatever the 3 damage spell is, I can't remember it offhand. You're 3/3 and you flash this guy in. It hits him, doesn't even kill him. You get a 1/4 left behind. It's not the best body ever, but it's there. It's not quite Spellskite level of power because, of course, you can't just do this every single time they cast a spell for 2 life, but still pretty decent to me. Probably not first pickable since it doesn't affect the board at all, other than being a 1/4 if it lives. So I'll go with like a B-. It's, again, as I said, one of those not a bomb, but totally cool utility creatures. Next up, we have Negate. This is a 1 of the blue instant at common, and it says, and you all should know this card. It's been in a billion sets in the history of Magic. It says counter target non-creature spell. Now, as I talked about with Bone to Ash, Ash to Bone? Bone to Ash. Creatures are the spells in Limited. Non-creature spells, as we've talked about, are not super duper common. And so Negate typically doesn't have a place for me in draft decks. It does in the sideboard. If I see really solid unconditional removal or something super awesome like a Citadel Siege level of power on an enchantment, then I'll side this in, but I'll never main deck it. In Sealed, I will main deck a Negate, because in Sealed, people are going to play a little bit wonkier stuff, a little bit slower stuff, a few more sorceries than they would normally play. So Sealed, I might main deck this. Draft, pure sideboard, it's got to be a D. Negate is a total D card. Always has been, always will be. Next up, we have Nibix Barrier. This is a 3 and a blue creature illusion wall at common, and it's an 0/4. It has flash, it has defender, it's a wall of course, and it says when Nibix Barrier enters the battlefield, target attacking creature gets -4/-0 until end of turn. This doesn't seem all that good to me. Walls are fairly rarely good. They're generally okay if they have some power and some cool effect, either when they come in or they have something like First Strike or Death Touch or something like that. There's the surprise factor. The surprise, I have a good blocker, or a decent, or an okay blocker, let's say. But I don't think that makes it overly playable. I think it's a solid D as well. You can bring it in if you're up against a super aggro deck, but solid D from me. Next up, we have Psychic Rebuttal. This is a 1 and a blue instant at uncommon, and it says counter target instant or sorcery spell. It also has Spell Mastery. If you have 2 or more instant and or sorceries in your graveyard, you may copy the spell countered this way. You may choose new targets for the spell. So this is interesting. It's like Negate, slightly weaker because it doesn't hit enchantments, it doesn't hit artifacts, it doesn't hit anything that's non-creature. It only hits instant sorceries. Before the Spell Mastery, which I think is, again, totally not main deckable in Draft and maybe main deckable in Sealed. But the Spell Mastery seems really interesting. Being able to copy the spell seems pretty cool. I don't know how impactful this will be. Again, the usual instants and sorceries warning from me, plus whether or not Spell Mastery is going to be on all that commonly. I just don't know if this is going to really fit. In Constructed, I can see this being pretty good. In a control deck in Constructed, you're going to have Spell Mastery on like turn 4 every game. And I could see this being fairly decent. But Limited, I don't know. This just falls into the sideboard for me, so total D. Next up, we have Ring Warden Owl. This is a 3 blue creature bird at common for a 3/3. It has flying, and it has prowess. So River Wheel Aerialists was okay. And that was a 4/5 flyer with prowess for 6. This is 1 mana cheaper, but it drops all the way from being a 4/5 to being a 3/3. Not really a big fan of this. I don't want to pay 5 mana for my 3/3 flyer. Sometimes it'll be a 4/4. Sometimes it'll be a 5/5. If you are just full of luck and mana and non-creature spells, maybe it'll be a 6/6. But realistically, it's going to be a 3/3 the vast majority of the time, and you're going to be paying a pretty hefty sum to get it on the board. I think it's an okay curve topper if you kind of really need it. You know, if you really are in the market for a 3/3 flyer, maybe. If you're in a heavy controlling deck and you know that you're just going to be facing an empty board by the time you can cast this guy, maybe he's okay. So I'm going to go with like C- on him. I just think he's cuttable in most cases. Next up, we have Scrapskin Drake. This is a 2 and a blue creature zombie drake at common, and it's a 2/3. It has flying as well, and it says Scrapskin Drake can block only creatures with flying. This is a reprint. It was in, I think, Avacyn Restored, somewhere in the Innistrad block. It's okay. It's no Alabaster Kieran. You know, you're trading Vigilance for can only block flyers, but it still serves its purpose. It's totally cuttable if you have better things, and totally includable if this is what you're in the market for. It's, for me, a complete run-of-the-mill C. Next up, we have Screeching Scab. This is a 1 and a blue creature zombie, just zombie, at common, and it's a 2/1, and it's a function. It's a reprint from Dark Ascension, and it's actually a functional reprint, or I guess Sultai Skullkeeper was the functional reprint in the previous set we were just in. It was okay. Or actually, sorry, I didn't read what it says. When Screeching Scab enters the battlefield, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. This was okay in Dark Ascension because milling yourself was pretty solid. As we'll see later, there were creatures that you needed to exile stuff out of your graveyard in order to cast. There was Flashback. There was decent stuff. In cons, the functional reprint Sultai Skullkeeper was okay, again, because there was Delve. In this format, I guess you're milling yourself to turn on Spell Mastery? But that just seems bad. I want those spells to be in my graveyard because I cast them, and then I'm getting extra value out of them. I don't want to just mill them off the top. So ultimately, I don't really see why this guy exists. As we'll see, there is a Scab in this set that requires creatures to be in your graveyard to exile, but it's 1 card. I don't see any other reason for this to really be played. I just think it seems kind of bad. I think it seems super duper cuttable, so C- from me. Maybe even lower. Next up, we have Send to Sleep. This is a 1 and a blue instant at common, and it says tap up to 2 target creatures. Spell Mastery! If there are 2 or more instants or sorcery cards in your graveyard, those creatures don't on-tap during their controller's next on-tap step. So for 2 mana, you can tap 2 creatures, and maybe you freeze them. Ojutize, Breath them, whatever you want to call it. This is super cheaply costed. This is 2 mana, and at instant speed. I really like this. Spell Mastery is one of these things that I'm going to have to see how often it's on. If it's on often enough, I think this card's really good. In a tempo deck, this would be incredible. 2 mana is so cheap to freeze 2 creatures. That being said, if Spell Mastery isn't something that turns on frequently, then this kind of drops down. Tapping 2 creatures just for a single turn isn't nearly as good. It can still be what gets your damage through, so I think it'll still be okay regardless, and so I'm going to give it a C+. But yeah, I'm going to have to see how readily Spell Mastery turns on. This could be higher. This could be lower. We'll have to see, but C+ for now. Next up, we have Separatist Void Mage. This is a 3 and a blue creature human wizard at common for a 2/2. And it says, when Separatist Void Mage enters the battlefield, you may return target creature to its owner's hand. So, more bounce. I do love bounce. Void Wielder was pretty decent. He was a 5-drop for a 1/4 that bounced a creature. This is a 4-drop for a 2/2. That seems even better to me. I really like this guy. I think he's an auto include in basically every blue deck that I'll be playing. I think I give him a B-. I'm excited to play with this guy. Next up, we have another reprint, Sidled Starfish. This is a 1 and a blue creature starfish at common for an 0/3 that says tap, scry 1. Good old Scryfish back from Theros or Born or Journey or wherever Scryfish was originally printed. He was a good guy back then. He's not going to do anything for your deck aggressively, but scrying 1 every single turn really helps smooth out your draws. Solid C for me. Cuttable, obviously, if you're trying to be super aggro, and totally includable if you're being controlly or mid-rangey or tempo-y or anything like that. Next up, we have Scav Goliath. This is the other Scav I was talking about. It's a 5 blue creature zombie giant at uncommon for a 6/9 that has trample. However, as an additional cost to cast Scav Goliath, exile 2 creature cards from your graveyard. So there were multiple Scabs in Dark Ascension. And so milling yourself, being blue-green self-mill most likely, you were putting creatures into your graveyard. And you were able to cast these 6/9 giants. And Scab, I can't remember what the other one was. I think it was a 4/5. I can't remember the name. And then, of course, there was the mythic one. In Dark Ascension, there was a lot of self-mill, and self-mill was good because of flashback plus the Scabs plus other things. I think it's harder to pull off here. I think it's harder to just get 2 creatures in the graveyard. That being said, if you can, a 6/9 with trample is no laughing matter. It's going to do a lot of work. I have to see how regularly you're going to be able to cast this guy, how confidently you're going to be able to cast this guy. I'm going to go with a C+. I remember him being pretty good in Dark Ascension. But that was a different format. That was a different time. That was a different set of mechanics. So I'm going to go with a C+ here. Has the potential for a lower floor than that. And maybe a higher ceiling, but I'm not sure about that. Next up, we have Soulblade Djinn. This is a 3 blue creature Djinn at rare for a 4/3. It has flying, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So basically prowess, except prowess for your entire team. Now, a 4/3 for 5 flying is pretty darn okay. This has the prowess problem, and I'm talking about that an awful lot. It is still good. It does still do stuff. Prowess does still do stuff. It just doesn't do stuff as much as people had thought it would originally. People were thinking of best case scenario mentality a lot. But giving your entire team prowess does seem pretty solid to me. If you get a single non-creature spell cast while this guy is out, you're still getting a pretty sizable effect in most cases. Keep in mind, if you do go heavy into instants and sorceries, you're going to have too few creatures for this effect to be all that meaningful. But I think this guy won't be too hard to put some solid use to, especially because he's a 4/3 flyer himself. Solid B for me. Next up, we have Sphinx's Tutelage. This is a 2 and a blue enchantment at uncommon. And it says, whenever you draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. If they're both non-land cards that share a color, repeat this process. And then for 5 and a blue, you can draw a card and discard a card. So you can loot for 6 mana, and then, of course, make your opponent mill hopefully 20 cards, right? But probably very rarely. Generally, you're going to make them mill 2. Because they're going to mill land cards a lot of the time. And then if they don't mill 2 land cards, if they do mill 2 non-land cards, there's still a relatively lowish chance they're going to match. There's too much in the decision tree that actually makes this happen a second time or a third time or a fourth time. I think this is just bad. It's an F. It's something to trap new players, and that's about it. Next up, we have Stratos Walk. Stratos Walk is a 1 and a blue enchantment aura at common, And it says enchant creature. When Stratos Walk enters the battlefield, draw a card. It replaces itself. Awesome. Enchanted creature has flying. Cool. Enchanted creature can only block creatures with flying. Less cool. So Stratos Walk was in Theros or Born or Journey, one of the three. And it was surprisingly okay, especially in aggro decks. Giving a creature flying pretty early in the game, especially one that shouldn't have flying, tends to be pretty decent. Yeah, it can only block creatures with flying, but if you're in an aggro deck, you're not blocking. You don't care. You're swinging in. You're attacking. In addition, this gets around the aura problem, the 2-for-1 problem, by replacing itself the second it enters the battlefield. You can still get 2-for-1 if they do kill the creature in response to you casting this. The aura goes to the graveyard, your creature goes to the graveyard, you don't draw a card. But all other situations you draw a card, you've at the very least replaced this. You're at the very least going to get, kind of 1-for-1 ultimately. So I think Stratos Walk's fine. I give it like a C+, I suppose. But beware that that's for aggro decks. That's for decks that are planning on attacking. You don't put this in a controlling deck. You don't put this in arguably even a mid-range deck. All right, next up we have Talent of the Telepath. This is a 2 blue sorcery at rare, and it says target opponent reveals the top 7 cards of his or her library. You may cast an instant or sorcery card from among them without paying its mana cost. Then that player puts the rest in his or her graveyard. Spell Mastery. If there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard, you may cast up to 2 instants and sorceries instead of 1. I really don't know about this card. It seems really high variance to me. Removal's gonna need targets, combat tricks are gonna require targets and very specific timing and board states. And that's about all the things you're gonna hit off of this, and you might not even hit anything because instant sorceries, blah blah blah. Ultimately, it doesn't seem worth it to include this. It feels like, friendly fire. It feels like those cards that are just essentially flip a coin and hope. I'd rather have a removal spell or combat trick that I know than maybe get one that I don't. So I'll give it a D. Probably should just be an F, but I've given out a lot of Fs in blue, and I feel bad for blue about that. So let's move on to Thopter Spy Network. Thopter Spy Network is an awesome name. It's also a 2 blue enchantment at rare that says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact, put a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Whenever 1 or more artifact creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. That is incredibly awesome flavor. It's a Thopter spy network that makes Thopters that hit your opponent for damage, and you get information from them, sort of, by drawing your own cards. But you get it. You understand the flavor behind it. You understand how it works. This card just seems really fun. It seems like a first pick build around me to get that Thopter artifact blue-red sub-theme going on. I think this card is awesome. You obviously want to be in the artifact deck because you do need an artifact to initially turn this on. But once it's turned on and starts making Thopters of its own, those Thopters will keep it turned on, even if they somehow kill your other artifact that originally turned it on. So keep that in mind. You do need an artifact to turn this on originally, but once it's on, boy, I think it's going to be good. I think it's going to be really good, enough that I'm going to give this an A-. It's a total build around me. It's going to be a really hard card to do anything with. Pack 3, pick 1. If you're not already in the blue-red artifact deck. But in that deck, pack 1, pick 1, I see this card being awesome, and I see going off with it a very real possibility. So A- from me, and boy, do I want to play with this card. Next up, we have Tower Geist. Tower Geist is a 3 and a blue creature spirit uncommon 2/2. It has flying, 2/2 flyer for 4. It also says when Tower Geist enters the battlefield, look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. You kind of get to scry, but you get to draw one, but you have to throw one away. You're kind of looting. I don't know exactly what you would say this guy's doing, but he's awesome. He was great in Avacyn Restored, and he should do the same here. A 2/2 flyer for 4 isn't unheard of. It's not the best costed creature, but it's fairly okay. But the card advantage and digging off the top and hopefully a lot of the time throwing away a land that you don't want. Yeah, this guy does a lot of work. He's pretty solid. I give him a B-. He's a pretty high pick for a blue deck, I would say. Next up, we have Turn to Frog. Turn to Frog is a 1 and a blue instant at uncommon, and it says until end of turn, target creature loses all abilities and becomes a blue frog with base power and toughness 1/1. Ribbit, says the flavor text. Turn to Frog's a solid card. It's been in several sets, and it's always pretty darn decent. It doesn't kill the creature, although you'll probably use it in a situation that will kill the creature. What you obviously do is you attack, or they attack, and you block or they block with something that's going to trade, or maybe just bounce off of it, and then suddenly you turn it into a 1/1, and it just dies. And that's awesome. It's blue removal. It's removal that's not necessarily guaranteed all the time and not super unconditional, but does often get its man, and you get to kind of decide when it happens. You're going to generally get the creature dead when you want it to happen. So I think it's just a solid card. I give it a B-. I find Turn to Frog to be pretty darn solid. Make sure you are using this as basically removal. Don't use this to prevent some damage to yourself. That's a really bad use of Turn to Frog, and I've seen people do that. If it's a desperation move, sure, but you don't generally want to be doing that. Next up, we have Water Coarser. Water Coarser is a 2 and a blue creature elemental at common, and it says pay a blue, Water Coarser gets +1/-1 until end of turn. The common water fire breathing. Also Flowstone, actually, from way back in the Wrath days. This is a 2/3, by the way. I don't know if I said that. So this is a 2/3, or it's a 3/2, or it's a 4/1. Or it's a dead 5/0 if you really wanted to. It's okay. You know, it doesn't quite get as big as some creatures in this vein have in the past, but it'll get you there. If you're in a blue aggressive deck, it'll get you there. It'll get you an extra 3 damage, or an extra 1 or extra 2 damage if you make it a 3 or 4 power creature. You can, of course, wait and see what happens, see what they block with. You can keep it as a 2/3. Unfortunately, it doesn't have kind of the Shore Crasher ability or the Morphling ability where you can, maybe make it a 1/4 or make it an 0/5. But I think it's still okay. I think it's still totally fine. I would give it a C+. It's not amazing. It's not bomby. It's not splashy. It's not a high pick, but it's a fine include. Next up, we have Whirler Rogue. This is a 2 blue creature human rogue artificer. It's got 3 types. I don't know if anything else in this set has 3 types. It's an uncommon, and it's a 2/2. And it says, when Whirler Rogue enters the battlefield, put 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield. Then you can tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Probably those 2 Thopters, but maybe some other stuff. And target creature can't be blocked this turn. So it's got a roguish ability. This seems like a real enabler for blue-red artifacts. Getting 2 Thopters out plus a 2/2 for 4 mana seems really good to me. This is 4/4 for 4, basically. 2 of them are flying. The ability seems pretty decent with the 2 Thopters, but if you have multiple Thopters, if you have multiple artifacts to turn on that unblockable ability, if you have Thopter Spy Network, if you have the synergies going on here, this guy's awesome. I think you take this guy pretty highly to try to get into the blue-red artifact deck, and he's going to be a definite role player there. I give him a B-. I find him pretty darn solid. Finally, in blue, we have Willbreaker. Willbreaker is a 3 blue creature human wizard at rare for a 2/3 that says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes the target of a spell or ability you control, gain control of that creature for as long as you control Willbreaker. Basically, Dak Faden's ultimate emblem on a creature that if the creature dies, you have to give the stuff back. Seems really fun. You definitely want a way to protect her. You want to pump her up. You want to give her hexproof. I don't know if you can in this set, and protection obviously isn't really in this set. But you want to protect her somehow. You want to keep her alive because it would suck to give all those creatures back. But if you can pair this with a tapper, so a Crow and Jailer with Willbreaker out, a Crowan Jailer basically says, pay 2 and a white, take control of target creature. And that's really awesome. Ultimately, this whole idea, this whole plan that I'm thinking of in this world that I'm living in is a little bit glass cannon-y, because all they have to do is Lightning Bolt Willbreaker and everything goes back to them, or Fiery Impulse, I think it's called. So yeah, glass cannon-y, but I'm going to get suckered into trying this at least once, and I think it is just good. I'm going to start out optimistically high on this one and give it a B+. So that's blue. Blue's interesting. We just ended blue with an A-, B-, B-, C+, B-, B+. That sounds awesome, but I also gave a lot of cards F in this color. That one card, I can't remember what it was. I gave it a D because I felt bad about all the Fs. Blue seems really hit and miss. It seems like the blue-red artifact stuff is pretty decent and pretty cool. But there's a lot of garbage enchantments and lots of counterspells and not great ones. I don't know what's going on with blue in this set. I am so excited to try out blue-red artifacts, and I'm so not excited to try out blue X anything else. It'll be really interesting to see how it plays. I'm so excited to play with Thopter Spy Network and Willbreaker. I could have swore there were some other cards. Disciple of the Rings, I think, will still be fun. Harbinger of the Tides, I'm excited to play with. But there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be really sad to see when I open my packs in a draft. Like, I was going to say Days Undoing, but I won't be unhappy. I think that's $25 right now. I'll take that. I'll take that and not play it. But other things like Jace's Sanctum and stuff like that. But yeah, that's blue. Definitely let me know what you think. I have a feeling I maybe have undergraded some of these cards, and I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments, but definitely let me know what you think, of course, on all of these ratings and all of these videos. Let me know where you agree. Let me know where you disagree. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at TheManaLeak. That's L-E-E-K, like the vegetable, not the card. And you can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/TheManaLeak. You've already found me here on YouTube. You've got the comment section down below. If you like the videos, you should click those little thumbs up icons. Let me know that you like the videos. Let the world know that you like the videos, and keep my videos rising up through the ranks. As well, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, you should. There's a button below each video and one in the outro of each video that'll keep you posted on all the latest Crack-a-Pack Tuesdays, Wacky Wednesdays, Spiky Saturdays, and any other special videos that pop up here or there, such as these set reviews. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you all next time.